2020 has been a catastrophic year with the deadly COVID disproportionately impacting Black communities, including Haitian communities. We're already surpassing 200,000 dead in the United States. Many you here, our colleagues, have lost loved ones. If this wasn't enough, folks are gripped by the murder of Breonna Taylor, whose murders walked free, George Floyd and countless others from the thin blue line being joined by the openly white supremacists such as the Proud Boys and Thursday's attempt at overthrowing Michigan's elected governor. Pendant que les États-Unis apprennent des faits, Haïti rejoignit dans une crise politique et économique manche longue. Depuis 13 janvier 2020, un jour après le 10e anniversaire du tremblement de terre, Haïti n'a pas de parlement pour forcer le président Jovenel Moïse pour passer l'ordre par décret. En juillet 2018, le Fonds monétaire international a mis l'État pression pour suspendre subventions produits pétroliers qui a inspiré une réponse populaire même les mêmes. Un petit calpe devant un mouvement populaire a réussi à juger corruption l'État comme Petro-Caribéa. En revanche, l'État a tué manifestants, journalistes et puis moun qui défendent droits mounio. Yon la vie chère massive et puis on paye l'autre qui fait institution yon campé. Avocat chef cabinet Montferrier Durval été assassiné dans le mois d'août. Depuis quelques semaines, un étudiant UAH été assassiné. As Toni Morrison famously said of moments of crisis, this is precisely the time when artists get to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity. Edwidge Danticat, who's among us, encouraged us to create dangerously. The theme is, in this year's conference, is Nula Pi Red. It is an assertion that we are here and we're here to stay. In Haiti and throughout the world, people are protesting against neoliberal austerity, state corruption, and the shift to authoritarianism and unbridled repression. This was how the call for proposals began, written long before COVID and George Floyd, not to mention many others that don't get the same attention. Moments such as these oblige scholars and professionals to do more than talk or write. We are compelled to come together to think critically and productively about how theory and practice intertwine and how to incite meaningful change. Today, instead of a single presentation, we are excited to have a discussion with 5 excellent panelists. As I say their name, you should see a link to their webpage. Edwidge Danticat, one of Haiti's leading lights, author of numerous books and recipient of numerous awards. There's a link to her page. Then followed, we have Mamire Duguay-Prosper, anthropologist at Davidson University, activist and connected with many social movements. She organized a very successful working session the other day. And we have Gerald Horn at Houston, history faculty, and an author of 40-some books in many languages. I read one of his books while I was working in Cuba. Then we have our vice president and program chair, Regine Jackson. She is a sociologist and chair of a department and working on issues of diaspora. And she's got new work that she'll tell you about. Finally, Sabine Lamour, also a sociologist, UAH professor, and director of SOFA, Solidarité Femmes Haïtiennes. So I will post the links to their websites in the chat. So I will ask each question, and then one by one, and then we'll have a discussion. So here goes. The first question, as a Haitian or a Haitianist, what connection do you see between these crisis events and the ways in which Haiti has been systematically punished for its role in challenging white supremacy? And I'd like Regine to start off.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you to all of you who have gathered today for our 32nd annual conference. I am absolutely honored to share this virtual stage with so many people whose work I've devoured over the years. But of course, Mark wants us to jump right in. And so just to respond to that question or to get us started, there's a way that unfortunately so many of the events that we hear about on the news and that we're experiencing, so much of this feels so uncomfortably familiar. The racial crisis that we're witnessing and experiencing today, I think, is part of a long history of the dehumanization of Black life. And this is something that, as a Haitian and as a sociologist and as someone who studies the Haitian diaspora, I really can't see it except through a transnational or global lens. The Haitian Studies Association conference always comes at a time of year where, in my undergraduate class, the history of social theory, we're talking about foundational 19th century sociologists, right? And I'm always trying to make room for scholars like Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells Barnett and W.B. Du Bois, people who've been excluded from the canon in my field in favor of European scholars like Karl Marx or Max Weber or Emile Durkheim. So recently I was rereading the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett and her crusade for justice as Black men were being lynched throughout the Southern United States. And there's this line in Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk about the global nature of white supremacy and the problem of racism. And he writes, where in the world may we go and be safe from lying and brute force? And at that moment, Du Bois and Wells Barnett were responding to radical Black activists at the time, who Du Bois describes as spiritually descended from Toussaint the Savior through Gabriel, Vesey, and Turner. And for me, it's really difficult to ignore the many ways that both the repeated instances of state-sanctioned racial violence and the current activist response all trace back to Haiti's challenge to white supremacy. I think if we take seriously the history of American imperialism and the racialized nature of these global economic inequalities that so many historians and scholars have alluded to, that it just doesn't make sense to continue to interpret these latest instances through a one-dimensional lens or as the particular experience or expression of American racism. I think it's important to keep the focus on how the system that produces these moments is simultaneously local and global. And this is what philosopher Charles Mills describes as a global white supremacy. And this is what this white supremacy has never been limited to, this anti-Black white supremacy has never been limited to Americans. It's certainly not limited to Haitians or Haiti or constrained by national borders. And so insufficient attention to these multiple dimensions of racism and anti-Blackness, I think, can become a very dangerous blind spot. So in my work, and I think it's very important to keep tracing these current events back, not only to earlier events in American history, but also to Haitian history and contemporary sort of manifestations of this brutal sort of violence against Black bodies in Haiti.
Thank you for that powerful introduction. I believe Gerald wanted to say something to this as well.
What I would like to do is make a proposal, and a proposal directed at the Center for Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and its longtime affiliation with my former colleague, Professor Michel. The proposal is for what I would call a Haitian abolition project or Haitian Pan-African project. I'm not wedded to either title. That is to say, to hire researchers to comb global archives between the triumph of the Haitian Revolution in 1804 and the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888, to seek documentation on what we already know it exists. And in fact, a number of writers, including myself, have already written about it, albeit without combing global archives. That is to say, Haiti's crusade against slavery, which was not only a stunning step forward for poor and working class people worldwide, but at the same time helps to respond to your question as to why there has been such persecution of Haiti over the decades. These documents, once accumulated, can be not only published online, but published in multiple bound volumes and placed in libraries all over the world. And I'm not only speaking of the typical archives, that is to say, those on the island and in the neighboring countries, Jamaica, Cuba, the usual sites, United States, France, UK, but also I have reason to believe we can also find documentation in archives off the beaten track. For example, Russia, for example, Japan, particularly Japan after the 1850s. And this does not even bring us to where we already know that there would be documentation in the South American countries, such as Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and not to mention the African countries, to the extent that the archives have not been racked by unrest and civil war, speaking of Liberia, Sierra Leone, et cetera. I'm confident that funding could be obtained for this ambitious project, not only from the usual sites, such as UNESCO, headquartered in Paris, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, where I dare say, because of the global nature of the project, it would get support from the member states of the United Nations that are represented in UNESCO, but also certain US-based foundations that I'm familiar with, such as the Mellon Foundation, once headed by Professor Earl Lewis, now at the University of Michigan. Some of you may be familiar with his work, and now headed by Professor Elizabeth Alexander, both of whom, of course, happen to be African-American, and not to mention, of course, the Ford Foundation, headed by another African-American, Darren Walker. So that's my proposal in lieu of giving an analysis to your very insightful question. And needless to say, I'm willing to pitch in with regard to this proposal.
Thank you. And we're deliberately inviting people to participate in this conversation that are spanning Haiti, diaspora, non-Haiti, people of different generations, artists, activists, historians, sociologists. So we like the fact that this is going to be a broad conversation with many perspectives. So belatedly, and in particular circles, Haiti and the Haitian Revolution received a footnote in the discussion of Black history following the state murder of George Floyd, in no small part because of the advocacy of H.S.A. members. Typically, the first reflex was the 1619 Project, which erases the Caribbean entirely from this conversation. And if the flurry of statements supporting Black Lives Matter are sincere and sustained, is a more conscious coupling of Haitian studies with Black studies mutually beneficial? What is to be gained by each, and what is risked? So I'd like to ask Maria to offer a few words here.
Moi, c'est un professeur haïtienne-américaine qui enseigne et qui écrit sur Haïti dans le département académique études africaines dans le pays États-Unis. Donc pour moi, ma connaissance là déjà faite. Et moi, pas une exception. Plusieurs membres fondateurs présidents H.S.A. c'est professeurs dans le département Black Studies, Africology, avec de l'autres variations politiques et études africaines. Champ d'études africaines varie selon Jean chercheur privilégié certaines méthodologies et espaces géographiques choisi analyser. Projet champ d'études africaines c'est mettre lumière sur points communs et parallèles qui existaient entre expérience domination et résistance, c'est-à-dire conditions matérielles et immatérielles africaines et diaspora africaine pendant la soulevée particularités historiques chaque espace. Qui donc est important, j'aimerais te rappeler nous l'année passée pour nous faire généalogie études haïtiennes dans le pays États-Unis, comme ça pour nous capables d'apprécier les relations naturelles avec études africaines. En 1968, élève baccalauréat dans l'Université d'État dans San Francisco, te manifesté pour exiger ça nous les jodi a une décolonisation département scientifique yo. C'est-à-dire un décollage avec définition et représentation mounité seulement selon expérience et spécifique garçon blanc hétéro bourgeois dans le pays nord. Et une reconnaissance moun noir asiatique ak chicano par exemple comme sujet ak agent historique. Les efforts ont été faits dans un contexte mondial côté différents groupes subalternes te levé campé contre différentes formes d'oppression qui tapent régit la vie. M'a parlé des mouvements anticoloniaux, des mouvements anti-impérialistes, des mouvements antiracistes, des mouvements contre le système hétéropatriarcal, des mouvements contre la guerre, des mouvements contre la dictature, tout partout dans le monde. Haïti pas en dehors dynamique globale ça yo. Pendant étudiants et professeurs te prend la rue dans le pays États-Unis pour revendiquer une autre construction ontologique moun, en Haïti, étudiants et professeurs te sous béton à revendiquer une autre façon pour exister et rentrer dans la relation une avec l'autre. C'est sur héritage ça, Haitian Studies, qui établi dans l'année 1988, campé journée jodi a. Membre fondateur H.S.A, c'est moun qui te grandi en bas dictature et résistance contre dictature d'Ivalier, qui te parti en exil dans le pays États-Unis et Canada pour continuer au soir avec famille, qui te parmi étudiants en 1968, au soir qui te bénéficié de mouvement et changement mouvement yo te porté en dedans l'autre département académique. Malgré jeunesse ça, études haïtiennes et études africaines n'a pas toujours les mêmes préoccupations et chercher dans chaque domaine pas toujours parler avec une autre. Moi rete quoi études haïtiennes et études africaines doit développer des relations plus étroites. Comme ça, études haïtiennes capable de rappeler études africaines que l'Empire États-Unis n'a pas limité à frontières politiques et insister pour savants africains continuer de montrer que un système capitaliste avec modernité produit catégorie raciale produit ça nourrit les moun noirs. Et comme ça tout études africaines capable d'encourager études haïtiennes et reconsidérer concept race là, c'est-à-dire système ségrégation population entre moun et ça qui pas moun dans la façon de comprendre la société apartheid en Haïti. Et pour continuer à faire valoir rapport femme-garçon avec sexualité critique pour comprendre différentes façons pour pouvoir fonctionner en Haïti. On campe là.
Merci, Mamira. Regine.
Yes, thank you for that, Mamira. That and really, what I want to offer is a similar kind of sentiment, right? That a coupling of Haitian studies with Black studies has some real potential, I think, to equip our students with a fuller knowledge of the past, right? And with that kind of more inclusive kind of Africana Studies project that Gerald alluded to, we as scholars and as students alike can really begin to grapple with how and why the stories we tell about our shared history get framed in the way that they do, right? Framed in ways that reproduce some of these power inequities. And, you know, the recent crises in the US and in Haiti that are related to, you know, public health and systematic racism and their intersections, I think have really exposed these long-standing inadequacies and fractures in institutions and practices and systems, and our academic disciplines are complicit in this, right? We participate in this. And this moment calls out for a more inclusive Africana studies, right? That centers a critical focus on colonialism, imperialism, diaspora. And I don't think that there's a risk in overshadowing the nuances or the particularities of a certain national history with a more transnational Black history at the center of Africana studies or Black studies more generally. Should I pass it on, Mark?
Yes, Sabine, qui ça vous pensez de question ça?
Ok. Pour ça qui concerne les questions ça, moi-même j'ai plusieurs interrogations. D'une part par rapport avec Jean question posée et en plus réponse que moi-même moi développé par rapport avec question ça. D'abord, il y a une première question première interrogation que me gagne, est-ce que haïtien a vocation pour réfléchir sur tout problème race qui gagne dans le monde là? on peut comprendre qu'à un certain moment, effectivement, nous devons faire un geste politique qui engage nous, geste 1804 là, mais parallèlement tout, il y a de violences policières qui passent tout à la fois en République dominicaine, en Guadeloupe, en Martinique, en Guyane, côté que nous avons deux Haïtiens qui sont capables de sembler Haïtiens qui sont majoritaires dans le pays, mais ils n'ont pas interpellé nous pour nous prendre position sur ça. Est-ce que c'est par rapport avec position impériale aux États-Unis qui fait nous obligés de prendre en position sur ça qui passait aux États-Unis? Parce que je pense qu'à un certain moment, tout, nous avons un problème pas nous demander dans la caille pour nous réfléchir et pour nous poser. Ça ne veut pas dire que nous ne sommes pas intéressés, mais ça ne veut pas dire non plus tout que nous obligés à chaque fois de décentrer nous de propres problèmes par nous, de façon question race poser la caille nous, parce que nous pas nécessairement dans le cadre côté race là, poser même genre avec les États-Unis. Question violence policière, ils n'ont pas posé même genre. Et moun qui à un certain moment répondent bien à eux, mais c'est qui c'est des gens de la classe moyenne. Majorité population qui sur les réseaux sociaux, ils ont indigné déjà de ba position yo par rapport. Est-ce que tout H.S.A. attend en catégorie haïtien bien précis tout répondre les problèmes yo posés tout, ou bien est-ce que c'est tout haïtien? Est-ce que nous attentifs à ça qui passe sur les réseaux sociaux parce que haïtien yo te getan bay opinion yo dit mais qui ça yo penser de ça qui passait, c'est comme quoi que ou senti que haïtiens sont indignés des écrans par rapport à ça qui passait George Floyd. Mais même pour qui ça me pensait que l'importante question pour H.S.A. t'a marandé avec l'autre étude qui concerne les gens noirs dans le monde là. Moi-même, je pense que pour Haïti, c'est comprendre comment l'empire là exporter raciste là dans la question saper souveraineté pays. Je pense que raciste a joué un rôle fondamental dans la dynamique ça qui était un élément pour nous comprendre parce que ces gens ont traité noirs aux États-Unis tout à un certain moment qui va permettre que nous comprenions comment raciste ça est capable de traiter un autre pays qui sont pays noirs parce que actuellement là les n'a regardé ça qui passé aux États-Unis en Haïti par rapport avec relation que li gagne avec Haïti nous capable nous pas gagner question raciste si gouvernement haïtien pas prend position sur question raciste c'est parce que à un certain moment tout rapport de d'infantilisation que le développé avec les États-Unis pas permettre que tout une position officielle qui sorti sous question George Floyd mais peuple haïtien lui-même il prend en position par rapport avec question sur les réseaux sociaux bien que faut nous comprendre toute dynamique à la fois classe qui est dans question parce que qui classe sociale qui est capable de faire une note qui pour aller dans le niveau international tout qui pour bailler position un groupe social bien défini sous question et non deuxième temps tout comment est-ce que pour nous plus attentifs avec gens population haïtienne répondre tout dans une série de problèmes je pense que construction raciste là États-Unis construit les puis exporter là tout ça capable permettre que nous comprendre à la fois comment est-ce que à un certain moment Haïti c'est un laboratoire nous avons des outils pour nous réfléchir mais en même temps sont des outils stratégiques pour nous goumer tout c'est-à-dire nos double dimension parce que élément ça est important et fondamental pour nous garder comment est-ce que question raciste ça structurer tout rapport États-Unis avec le reste du monde là est capable à la fois c'est pas uniquement fait de réflexion porter de nouveaux concepts c'est pas uniquement ça mais c'est de concepts pour nous déjouer tout ça qui a passé qui pour permettre que nous reprendre ça nous après les nous-mêmes en Haïti moniter nous parce que toute stratégie utiliser raciste pour déconstruire souveraineté li déshumaniser haïtien tout en dedans société haïtienne parce que le gouvernement américain au mépris de tout ça peuple haïtien a besoin il décider que à un certain moment mais ça qui est important pour lui mais agenda parle et agenda ça li entre en gouvernement la donne alors que peuple haïtien lui-même il a propre agenda parle agenda ça li médiatisé par li structuré par raciste mais parallèlement tout faut nous admettre tout que nous pas une conception fine de ça qui a passé dans la mesure haïtien de refuser penser sous question race nous de refuser penser gens question coloriste imprégner société nous et nous de refuser penser tout sur comment est-ce que dans rapport diplomatique que nous gagnons avec de l'autre société comment est-ce que question ça arrêtons question fondamentale parce que geste 1804 là c'est un geste tout côté que nous te couru des questions racistes à tout. Et il vient rester un langage pour nous, son grammaire que lié pour nous comprendre rapport nous ensemble avec de l'autre et peuple. Et on grammaire tout pour nous comprendre rapport nous ensemble avec une bonne l'autre entité qui est capable, que ce soit la bourgeoisie haïtienne, que ce soit l'État haïtien ou bien que ce soit au niveau international le rapport que Haïti a développé en pays là. Moi-même, moi pense que à un certain moment, faut que nous t'a réfléchi pour nous t'a regarder comment t'a capable bien de groupes de réflexion à la fois sous question coloriste qui était un élément fondamental dans la société haïtienne parce que nous pas nos cas de figure côté que rapport complète nous face avec une dynamique binaire côté que là nous gagnons en catégorie là l'autre côté nous avons l'autre catégorie nous face à un autre élément qui ça élément ça y comment pour nous comprendre ni et là nous comprendre ni comment est-ce que là nous saisir question ça à l'intérieur et comment est-ce que même outils que nous saisir là à l'intérieur là nous capable peaufiner les outils ça et comprendre qui ça le bail les sorties dehors à la fois dans rapport nous ensemble avec nous pour nous-mêmes et à la fois dans rapport l'autre nous ensemble avec nous. Je pense que c'est deux éléments qui capable important mais faut nous admettre tout que pas gagnant université tout en dedans pays à tout qui capable permettre que discussion fine ça au fait et que recherche ça au fait sous question c'est-à-dire c'est chaque grand monde qui est intéressé qui capable faire travail ça pour continuer malheureusement l'autre élément que ça permet tout ça permet que Haïti réfléchisse sur Haïti tout parce que en général nous prenons deux catégories qui sortent de l'autre côté nous penser tête nous alors que moi penser que nous-mêmes nous capables bien de catégories que nous générer à l'interne qui permettent que nous penser nous-mêmes comme haïtiens et qui en même temps permettent que nous offrir monde là tout de catégories qui capable permettre de comprendre ça qui passe mais qui mot que nous ca mettre sous yo mais qui non que nous ca ba yo parce que tant que Camus dit nous déjà les nous mal nommer réalité avec deux concepts qui pas adaptés ça fait que nous ajouter à misère monde là. C'est-à-dire, c'est offrir, c'est faire que Haïti, effectivement, dit tout nos laboratoires qui est capable de penser à la fois question race là, côté que nous capables, même à un certain moment, retirer question couleur pour à toute question ça là donne, garder nos dimensions, comment est-ce que yo considérez monde et comment est-ce que nous-mêmes nous considérons monde et qui ça signifie pour nous, à la fois pour nous et pour l'externe.
Merci. C'est une vraiment intéressante analyse qui m'a rendu question race à Pi. Donc, n'a retourné ça puis devant. So, bringing together Haiti's positionality as a unique entity and a particular entity and its relationship to the diaspora and U.S. empire. Gerald, you may not remember, years and years ago when I was a graduate student, you gave a talk, and that talk still sticks with me. I wanted to make sure you had a chance to answer this question. In this current moment, is a more conscious coupling of Haitian studies with Black studies mutually beneficial? What is to be gained? What is to be risked? What is risked?
Well, thank you. I would say that there is much to be gained. For example, I think that it would particularly help Black studies being taught in the United States because it would be a step towards a sort of transnational and more global examination of this important topic, number one. And number two, I think it would help the teaching in the United States because it could help to compel an examination, a more critical examination of the toxic legacy of slavery, of colonialism, and of settler colonialism. More to the point, I think that there is much to be gained, not least because of the linkages and commonalities between the two fields. That is to say that one of the reasons why Black people in North America have suffered so grievously over the decade is because slavery in this country was abolished without reparations, obviously, but without compensation to the slave owners as well, which was the case in the British Caribbean, so-called. And what that tends to suggest is that the slave owners were outraged by the expropriation without compensation of billions of dollars in property, within the property then walking amongst them saying that they're equal. We all know that in Haiti, at least initially, there was no compensation, but then there was a punishing imposition of payments that the new government had to pay to the former slave masters and their government in France. And so I think that that particular linkage, that is to say, what has been the legacy of abolition of slavery, is something that unites the two fields. Now, of course, it would be a mistake to collapse the two fields. There are obvious distinctions between a sovereign regime in the Caribbean and a people in North America who do not exercise sovereignty and in fact are subject to a pernicious sovereignty. But even that difference, it seems to me, could be the beginning of a dialogue that could lead to further uniting and further walking hand in hand towards a brighter horizon. And I say this in particular because I noticed in your introductory remarks, which were very timely, you made reference to this very perilous moment in the United States right now, particularly the tragic events that have just unfolded in Michigan. And I dare say, and I'm afraid to say, that I don't see that as a one-off. I don't see that as any sort of episode that is unique to the Great Lakes states. I think as we creep closer to November 3rd and its aftermath, we'll be seeing more episodes, which I think will put in jeopardy many of us on the Zoom call.
Right.
Therefore, bespeaks a crying need and a crying necessity to rely upon our friends in the international community, such as our Caribbean friends who exercise sovereignty and therefore are able to speak up on our behalf. I mean, for example, there have been a number of references to George Floyd during our brief conversation. Some of you may not know that in June 2020, the African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, filed a petition at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland, for a commission of inquiry into what they term, quote, systemic racism, unquote, in the United States of America. Now, Washington twisted arms in order to make sure that this resolution did not take flight. But I see that as a very crucial and critical opening that obviously then could redound to the benefit of our friends in the Caribbean. Once the microscope is turned upon our mutual antagonists in Washington.
Very much rich discussion. Reminds me of the letter from Cairo about the internationalism, about how we can generate some sovereignty, but also solidarity that sovereignty provides. This does lead to the question of Haiti's place within the world is often exaggerated. I'm going to read this next question in Creole. Dans un texte, The Odd and the Ordinary, Michel Wolfe-Trouillot te dit, puis plus Haïti présenté comme bizarre, puis facile lié qu'oublier Haïti, c'est laboratoire néocolonial, puis long dans l'hémisphère. L'astaffaire Gina Athéna Ulysse a fait impact. Haïti méritait discours tout neuf. En anglais, Haiti needs new narratives. Est-ce que moment ça exige nous pour suspendre discours exception ça? Qui ça qui gagne les discours à Haïti doit monter et puis prendre place?
Of course, Gina's clarion call about Haiti needing new narratives is something that, was very timely and long overdue at the same time, right? I think, of course, we need new narratives that center the humanity of Haitian people. And at the same time, I know that's a strange thing for me as a social scientist to say, to appeal to this kind of more humanistic kind of approach, but also one that can pay attention to precisely what we've been calling attention to on this panel, right? These systemic and global dimensions of oppression, of all of the ways that racism and capitalism and patriarchy are intertwined, right? And how they take these different forms geographically and historically. differently. I think these narratives require a new and more critical, a more nuanced vocabulary than we currently have when talking about Haiti. I know personally, if I never hear the phrase, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere again, it's not too soon not to retire that sort of way of talking about and thinking about Haiti. And I think it's important to really pay attention to how white supremacy, again, I'm back to white supremacy, right? How white supremacy sort of evolves over time, how it links up with these other systems that it is, that sort of reproduce it and feed it. And as Trudeau noted, right, we're always being told in various degrees that Haiti's unnatural or erratic or therefore unexplainable, but it's not Haiti that's unique or bizarre, right? It's the white supremacy that's unnatural, that's odd, right, and grotesque. And I think we need narratives that keep our attention on Haiti and the humanity of Haitian people, but also ones that are unapologetically critical of the ways that white supremacy has tried to create the very conditions that it criticizes Haiti for.
Bon, c'est à partir du moment que nous construisons un monde ou bien un espace tant qu'on un espace exceptionnel, ça veut dire tout. Nous avons tendance tout pas ouais moun sa yo tant que c'est humain yo gen de bagay yo fait que tout le monde ka fait. On pense que quelle que soit réalité que nous vivons en Haïti, sont réalité qui est capable d'historiciser, que nous sommes capables de mettre dans un continuum et qui permet de nous comprendre comment est-ce que de 1915 à peu près que Haïti a vécu en situation pour jusqu'à présent, par exemple 2015 qui fait nous presque un siècle, comment ça est capable de permettre que nous comprenions un bon discours, un bon élément qui passait en dedans la société et particulièrement par rapport avec les États-Unis. Et donc, comme je dit dans la première question, pas jamais oublier que Haïti fait expérience qu'on baille pour un bon élément en dedans à la fois et ça n'a pas les suprémacistes blancs, que ce soit dans le cas de l'esclavage, que ce soit dans le cas de pita, on a vu regarder comment est-ce que colonisation lui-même l'a vu prendre de l'autre forme, même si Haïti effectivement il dit son pays indépendant, comment est-ce que question souveraineté à chaque fois remettre en question et a toujours un bon élément. Ça pas veut dire que haïtiens yo même tout yo pas gain de action que opposé qui permettent que ça est possible. Mais il faut nous garder tout que discours qui a exceptionnalisé Haïti, c'est de discours tout qui pas permettre nous comprendre l'espace, qui pas permettre nous historiciser ça qui a passé. Et à partir du moment où pas historiciser ça qui a passé, ou pas capable de saisir dans toute dimension et garder marconnage que tout rapport de pouvoir yo fait entre eux pour yo bail espace là en forme. Et moi-même, moi pense tout, effectivement, Haïti besoin pour nous penser un nouveau narratif voulu. Haïti besoin de nouveaux récits. Parce que tout récit que Haïti construit sous tête, Haïti construit à partir de l'autre récit. C'est ça que je suis capable de récit maître. Comment est-ce que c'est des récits qui construisent de l'autre côté, sous espace par eux, et puis nous juste prendre concept et puis nous plaquer. Moi-même, par exemple, dans la thèse de sociologie que moi j'ai fait, moi regardé que effectivement, regardez toute l'autre société, il y a un rapport verticalité par rapport avec l'autorité, pas représenter ça, représenter un dans la société, mais est-ce que société ça, qui c'est de société post-esclavagiste, y compris Haïti, te voulait dire nous que papa pas autant important, je nous comprends à l'intérieur de famille. Nous avons l'autre type de dynamique familiale qui mettait famille au centre de famille. Pour qui ça type de dynamique familiale ça et pour qui ça tout à un certain moment que lien du sang n'est pas tellement important pour nous dire que à un tel c'est race moins un tel c'est famille, c'est-à-dire il y a des narratifs qui construit déjà tout en dedans la société narratif ça qui ça n'a fait ensemble avec eux, comment est-ce que nous gagnons pour nous retirer narratif ça dans ça nous tarelé comme si on dit que c'est pas important, c'est de narratifs vil parce que nous c'est deux monde qui a vili yo dit tout ça n'a vivre tout c'est dans dimension ça accueillir mais tout narratif qu'a construit populaire qu'a construit à l'interne autour du vaudou a fait de parole pour qui raison obligé à chercher un discours sous participation politique femme alors que Moins gen un archétype la caille moins qui sont archétypes certes qui en est dans vaudou qui c'est Azuli dans toi qui sont femmes qui déjà représentées qui ça veut dire pouvoir pour femme. Pour qui raison pas travailler avec archétype ça? Pour que moi signifier qui ça l'enfant gain pouvoir qui ça signifie et c'est pas un pouvoir que me gagne parce que me besoin entrer dans l'espace public non moi un pouvoir plein dans mes mains l'on regarder façon que y a montré que archétype ça a déployé à la fois par rapport à indépendance sentimentale li par rapport avec indépendance économique li par rapport avec indépendance sociale li c'est-à-dire tout ça yo c'est de forme social qui gagne dans la société haïtienne et c'est de forme anthropologique tout que nous gagnons pour nous saisir pour nous construire narrative là. Question parole violence sous forme effectivement c'est un problème que lié mais est-ce que gens externes nous montrent nous pour nous traiter question ça est-ce que c'est seule façon que le gain pour le traiter est-ce que façon rapport femme avec garçon organisé en Haïti est-ce que li entrer dans dynamique pour nous offrir protocole que nous offrir pour nous faire prise en charge de violence sous femme je pense que un bon élément comme ça dans la société haïtienne qui c'est deux éléments que nous pas prêter attention ensemble avec eux parce que yo pas apprendre prêter attention avec eux mais c'est deux éléments qui ont potentiel pour porter ça n'a pas les nouveaux narratifs là. Et nouveau narratif ça c'est pas pour Haïti seulement la pied, l'a juste montré que ça que n'a construit comme universalité à tout peuple dans le monde là capable à un certain moment poser élément dans la ville comme un élément universel parce que c'est de humains qui vivent réalité ça à un certain moment et réalité ça puisque au concerne monde yo ka une dimension universelle en dedans parce que actuellement là moi pense que Haïti a un pile pour l'expliquer monde là même par rapport avec ça que n'a brûlé même ça que après l'austérité par exemple moi rappelle que j'étais en France il a parlé de austérité mais là m'a parlé avec collègues français on même dit mais ça n'a pas parlé là moi même moi connais dans pays sous nos plan ajustement structurel mais qui dynamique que nous te mettez pour nous te goumer contre lui or il dit non plan d'austérité pas gagné pour avec ajustement structurel c'est-à-dire nous même nous guettons pas d'avance bonne réalité que nous guettons vivre déjà nous capables de construire un narratif autour de réalité ça à la fois politiquement et comme dit à la fois théoriquement et à la fois en termes de stratégie politique je pense que premier élément c'est déconstruire nous comme exceptionnel et deuxième élément c'est reprendre tout ça qui la caille nous qui à un certain moment une vocation qui vous permettre nous comprendre tête nous comme monde qui pas nécessairement obligé partager ou imaginaire nous pas obligé mettre soulier l'occident dans pied nous pour nous comprendre tête non okay. Nous capable mettre propre soulier pas nous notre pied nous pour nous comprendre réalité nous et offrir l'autre monde de concepts qui autour de nous offrir de l'autre monde de concepts pour comprendre ça qui passe moi-même moi penser dans la question ça n'a pas les nouvelles formes de famille qui apparaissent là mais Haïti question nouvelle forme de famille dans son blague liée les n'a regarder comment est-ce que à n'importe quel moment on monde jeune petit monde est capable de faire vocation effectivement qu'on gagne un pile abus qu'on bon bonne l'autre bagaille qui qu'on fait dans la question ça mais dynamique familiale ça c'est pas de dynamique familiale qui vraiment étranger avec pays c'est qui institution que nous capable mettre dans des dynamiques ça pour éviter dérive parce que institution que nous observons yo pas entrer dans cadre paradigmatique qui permet de comprendre réalité ça et en vision du monde et en approche épistémologique qui permettent que ou saisir réalité ça dans toute dimension en relation avec un espace qui construit un espace.
Merci. C'est un paquet de bagailles qui pour réfléchir en même temps. Sabine was sharing something that I've held dear, that if you want to look at what global capitalism looks like, don't just look at New York City, look at Port-au-Prince. You know, Haiti is not an exception. It's an early warning system. It's a canary in the coal mine. So this is a very provocative discussion, and thank you for it. Does this moment call for us to put away exceptionalism as a discourse? Which meta-narrative about Haiti should emerge to take its place? Edwige, very, very happy to hear what you have to say. You're muted. I'm going to give you a bottle of steak étoile, Reggie, and you were so right about
okay.
that.
Bonjour tout le monde. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I went back and reread that essay, which is an exceptional essay, and it made me miss both of you so much. But there's so many of you and H.S.A. who carry on that light. So it's really amazing. I was thinking with Gina's call for new narratives, and I think we have to be careful that, and in the creative side of things, when we're always sort of confronted when people say new narratives, they want utopian narratives from us, right? So, and I don't think that's what Gina meant. So, and I'm glad that Sabine made that distinction in terms of people in the presentations of Haiti, and in a way Sabine was so on point in the sense that, faut nous mettre sous les panneaux, right? We have to tell our own stories, as uncomfortable as they may be, so that in the quest for new change narratives, complex narratives, nuanced narratives, as Gina said, but not the sense of utopian narratives, because in the creative space, people always want you to go to the beach, right? As a new narrative, they're like, write happy things. But Haiti, I think in terms of both exceptionalism and magical as magical land, right now is at least on the world stage in two very, very interesting ways. So there was an article, I think yesterday in the Miami Herald about this judge who will have her confirmation hearing tomorrow with these Haitian children, right? And every time that the judge is mentioned, the fact that she adopted 2 children from Haiti is presented as a testimony to her, how wonderful, how humane she is. And I have, when I watched that super spreader event, I was watching the Haitian children, and I was thinking what this means for them sitting there with this president who called the country they come from a shithole country, but also the role now that suddenly their bodies takes on. Like there are, and every time that the woman, you mentioned she has 7 children, but the Haitian children are always plucked out. And what does it mean if you have, are the other children singled out? And so I think that's the one way we're on. I just wish people said she had 7 children and leave it at that, right? For the sake of those children, for example. But that falls into a narrative in Haiti, and the way that our bodies, like these little bodies, are now representing adoption, transnational adoption, colonialism. And so that's one aspect of it. And then there was Kanye's visit to Haiti, right? In this cultural space. And these exceptionals that were done for him. And I was watching very closely what the president who's ruling by decree, what he chose to show Kanye, right? And we can see in through whatever Kanye saw is what the people currently in Haiti consider tourism. And Kanye, who has always said that slavery is a choice, now is volunteering to complete a revolution for us. So I think all of this falls into this, this narrative of exceptional poverty from which we have to be rescued, and exceptional, I guess, dancers, exceptional and will Haiti make Kanye change his mind about who we are and so forth. So I think that these are moments in the days to come to follow in ways that the exceptionalism of Haiti is used. And Sabine, to your earlier point about how the state responds to what's happening, repression elsewhere, right? I remember when in the Dominican Republic, and this week is the anniversary, the 83rd anniversary of the Dominican massacre, the Haitian massacre, the massacre of Haitian kin workers in the Dominican Republic. There was state silence on that. And this was then under Martelly, but there was no response. So in terms of new narratives about Haiti, I think for me, I'm going at it from the creative space. And for example, there's a book that's coming out with soon by a African-American writer, Caitlin Greenridge, which is very interesting. It's post-revolution, and people go, and African-American performers going to Haiti to perform in these wonderful state-of-the-art theaters. that's a new narrative. That's a story we've never seen. That's a kind of a bridge that we've never had before. But I think it will be interesting to follow in the days to come. For me, I thought that was particularly poignant of how Haiti is presented in the next week or so in these hearings, because it's like what Paul Farmer's the uses of Haiti, how the uses of Haiti fall into these types of narratives, now a very newsworthy narrative to follow in the week ahead.
Thank you so much for bringing that home. A lot of us were thinking about some of the echoes of the exceptionalism as performed by celebrity and the use of Haiti as a stage for people's goodness or their righteousness. So Mamira, want to close us out on this question?
Boy, give me the tough job. Sabine avec moi, j'ai discuté pendant longtemps hier soir parce que ça a été vraiment inspiré nous. Et comme nous partageons la même perspective là, plus ou moins, moi, je vais profiter de répondre en anglais. Cleo was right when he encouraged us to move beyond the narratives of exceptionality when talking and writing about Haiti. As I mentioned in my previous answer, Haiti is not outside of global trends and dynamics. What makes it seem exceptional is that, as Mark has pointed out, and Sabine, that it has served as a laboratory for the colonial project to adapt and perfect itself, especially since independence, right? So I'm gonna give us sort of, a trajectory through history. And as Gerald pointed out, right, how some of these same things came to be applied in other spaces in the Caribbean, right, and also in the United States. Right, if you consider, right, reparations that were given to slave-owning planters when, right, they lost property. Let's consider how territories that threaten, right, the various global hierarchies and the concept of property to promote different arrangements of land and human relations, right, are isolated and stifled. Thinking about Haiti, right, early 19th century, but we're thinking about also Cuba, right, after the Cuban Revolution, and more recently, Venezuela. When we consider, right, how specific racialized peoples are dispossessed of their land, their labor, and their humanity, and circulated within their territorial borders, but also within empire. When we consider how racism becomes institutionalized and unnamed, when we consider how the state organizes the abandonment of people whose humanity is questioned, when we consider how previously colonized spaces are encouraged to develop by integrating, as if they had not already been integrated, into the world system and retaining the same colonial function, right, which is extractivist, export-oriented, monocrop, agricultural, and later industrial plantations. When we consider how the producers of global commodities subsidize the state, right, so capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. When we consider how financial capitalism has its roots in Wall Street's colonization of Haiti, right, and the rest of the Caribbean space. But also when we consider how reactionary nationalists construct the nation in Blackness to kick out the feminists, non-gender conforming people, right, and people who identify differently around sexuality, how they use Blackness, right, to leverage themselves as what we talk about here in the States, a misleadership class, right, a Black misleadership class to perpetuate, right, the coloniality and raciality of power. And when we consider more recently the shift to right-wing authoritarianism, the rise of evangelicals pushing a white supremacist, anti-voodoo and anti-woman agenda, right, Haiti then shows us, right, that has always been and continues to be a warning for things to come. But also, as Sabine pointed out, right, Haiti is a horizon for what is possible, right? A different cosmovision of the world and spirituality, a move away from modernity's binaries, right, of gender, of race, a different interpretation and practice of the human beyond man, on the horizon of a non-biological and non-heteropatriarchal concept of the family, of non-monetized community relations and land stewardship, what we call combit, right? And a different human relations to the land and to the planet. So I think, right, in the ways that Haiti appears bizarre is that it's offering a warning, but also offering us a horizon. And I think these are the kinds of new narratives that we should leverage in talking about, right? Why Haiti seems bizarre.
We're talking about the complexity of the narrative, and that we're not trying to create it as a, as a sanitized or utopic, to use Edwidge's term, vision for the future, but it is both warning and new possibilities. It reminds me of the Combahee statement that to be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. Like recognizing the full humanity of Haiti, not just objects for other people to be good, to be doing do-gooding on, but to be recognized as the subjects of the history and agents of the history. So how do we foreground perspectives that has historically been excluded and paint a more complete picture of Haiti's past and possibilities for the future? Regine, we've been thinking about this as a program. Can you give us a little insight here?
Yeah, and really, I want to pick up on something that Sabine mentioned in her remarks, and that's what I think is the importance of a focus on Haitian women. I think now more than ever, it's important to make room for women's voices, to make sure that that they are being uplifted as leaders of this next Black liberation movement. I think we have to amplify the voices of Haitian women by giving them bigger platforms to be heard. There's this line in Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, addressed to his 15-year-old son. And I think about this often, as my own son is, the same age as his when he wrote that in 2015. And he writes, this is your country, this is your world, this is your, and I'm skipping some passages, this is your body, and you must find a way to live within all of it. And that's what I think is really important, to think about how we can use this moment to put our words into action and to create these spaces where, in particular, I think Haitian women's voices and experiences and strategies of resistance have been overshadowed or marginalized. I think we can use this moment as a call to privilege Black women's agency in a way that we haven't necessarily done before, either in Haitian studies or in Africana studies.
Mark, may I add something? What Regine and both Sabine were saying leads me to this other segment of the 2-year essay, which is about Muna Deyo, right? People in the provinces, people in the what they call the outside country, even in the way that it's phrased, Muna Deyo, Muna Deyo, and I think that's to his point in the essay. That's a very he says that he feel like he learned more about studying the peasantry in Dominica about the Haitian peasantry than he did in Port-au-Prince, for example. So I think in this line of empowerment, also empowering people from Munandu, people from the outside country. I'll give a personal example here. My mother-in-law is with us, and we've been through the pandemic she's 86 years old, but she can't wait to get back to her place in Cavaillon, which is outside of Les Cayes. And because she says, she feels safer there. And I think in ways to also, how do we harvest what is working and that setting, what is working in that environment? What has worked, what has kept people basically who are really functioning outside of the state without help from the state, but who are very reliant on each other. So how do we amplify those voices?
We're talking about how the excluded peoples, marginalized peoples, and intersectional marginalizations. One of the things we did H.S.A. this year was to create spaces for people to take up themselves as working sessions. So on Thursday, for example, we had a working session that centered the experiences of not just artists, but LGBT artists who are explicitly writing about their marginalization as queer folk in Haiti, what the multiple meanings are. So these last questions are going to help us think through what we can do structurally. We are a small organization, nous pitime nous fort. We are a strong organization. The fact that we're trying to meet in this pandemic online speaks to your all's tenacity in keeping us, the board, engaged. So the theme of this conference is an assertion, nous là, we're here and we're here to stay. In addition, we're intentionally calling upon members in the association as a whole to examine our praxis. What does truly transformational scholarship look like? What do the current crises, however you define it, oblige you to do to address it? Regine, can you give us your start off?
Yes, the theme of our conference this year, as Mark noted, is an assertion. It's an assertion about our presence. It's an assertion about our continued efforts to challenge some of the negative ways that Haiti and Haitian scholars and Haitian bodies have been sort of treated in the academy and in the West. But it's also an assertion that comes from our membership. There was a moment at our last conference in Gainesville, in Florida, when everyone, sort of took time out of the closing banquet, the closing event, and came together and wrote this very powerful statement as an organization about what was going on in Haiti and our response to it. And something that's significant about that for me in terms of thinking about what transformational scholarship looks like is that the themes and the ideas and the initiatives are really coming from the ground up, as opposed to scholars sort of pontificating at this, from this detached perch and saying what we should focus on and where we should put our energy. And that in some ways is the obligation that I feel as a member of the Haitian Studies Association, as someone who is on the board, to pay attention to those questions and those issues that are coming from the membership, right? That are coming from Haiti and from our communities that we not only want to study, right, but that we want to hear and privilege their experiences and what they want us as an organization to do.
2 years ago when we were in Haiti, and it was also a very tough and difficult moment in Haiti when H.S.A. was being held there, and there was, should we come, should we not come, and what went throughout the conference, I thought, was, and it's something that we should continue to do, is to find ways of being a bridge to the communities where we live, or the communities we feel affinities to. Because, for example, now, I'm in Little Haiti, and there's so much pain in our community. And sometimes it's something like, someone will call from an organization and say, I have 2 people who have no home right now. And so I think if there are scholars who work in a certain field who have access to organizations, I think in finding ways to be a connector in that way. And I think I go back, to Michel Laguerre, who I read when I was very young. And his scholarship did such a big service, I thought, at that time in the early 80s, when people were being hospitalized for mental disorders because they went to a doctor and said, "Moi j'ai dépression." Right, and because now suddenly his work was distributed to doctors, because people realized that was a problem. So I don't know how that would look like for each individual one of you, but I've always seen that as a kind of example of how life-changing a certain kind of scholarship can be. But that only happens through connections with groups that are on the ground, that are doing the day-to-day, which is really hard and merciless in the way I've seen the people around me doing it. But ways in which, I think everybody has to figure out what that means for them, but ways in which you could connect with people who are actually doing the day-to-day in some way, whether you can contribute ideas, consultation, but ways like that of actually connecting with working groups of the people who are working on the issues every single day.
Thank you. Cheryl, what does a truly transformational scholarship look like? And what are the current crises oblige you right now to do to address it right now? As someone who's been engaged for a long time, how do we make our scholarship in the service of the struggle? Remember to unmute yourself.
First of all, just to reiterate and return to my initial proposal, that is to say a transnational project to comb the archives globally to extract documents between 1804 and 1888, the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, to the end of Brazilian slavery, in order to highlight and underscore and underline the role that this new Black Republic played in one of the most earth-shaking developments of all humanity, that is to say, the abolition of slavery. And I think that that sort of project, which could be published in bound volumes, put online, could be an example of creating new sources for new narratives. Because certainly, if you're going to talk about new narratives, as a historian, it seems to me you need new sources. Now, I would also say that as for myself, I think that it's not only a necessity, as many of us do, to publish with university presses or more established presses, but also to try to publish with progressive publishers, to publish with Black publishers, because I think we also need to be talking about building and strengthening this alternative literary and cultural infrastructure. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that when we're talking about strengthening this alternative cultural and literary infrastructure, we're really talking about helping ourselves. Because I think that one of the reasons that the academy comes under so much pressure from the right wing, from reactionary forces in the United States, is because the academy is a place, at least in many sites in the academy, where you can do progressive work and do even radical work and be rewarded for it, for disseminating radical and progressive ideas, which obviously is going counter to the traditional waves that are now coursing over this country. And it's unclear to me how long that contradiction will last. At the same time, I think that we should use our writing ability to also intervene more in the mainstream press in terms of op-eds, for example, in terms of letters to the editor, for example. I think we need a much more concerted effort in that regard. And then flipping the coin over, I think we need to intervene more in the Black press and in the progressive press. Black radio, for example, is a thriving institution from the Atlantic to the Pacific in this country. Black newspapers, of course, have been around for almost 200 years, and many of them are still thriving. So I think that there is much more that can be done, and I'm sure that much more will be done.
Thank you. We had hoped to be in Washington this year. Elections have consequences, people. The pandemic is not a human, it's all disasters. It's not a natural event. It's a human and political interaction, and we would like to be able to be there. One of the things we were going to do is having sessions with policymakers and teaching us scholars how to write policy briefings, how to prepare policy briefings, how to write op-eds. So hopefully that's going to still be possible. In the meantime, we do have these working sessions that hopefully will continue, and we'll be able to have some skills building be part of those conversations as well. We have a few minutes if folks want to jump in.
Can I add a little bit
please.
more? I think I want to emphasize everything Professor Horn said, but also about the part on the op-eds and the media presence, right? And I don't know if it's something H.S.A, I think you all are in universities more than I am, but some people have like a media department for press opportunities, so that if someone needs a Haiti expert, or do you have someone they can who could offer you need a Haitian economist, I have this person. I think that's also something that would be really worth doing in terms of just having people who are really well versed. So it's not always the same people, and then also there's a broad range of views. And certainly with the Black press, you know, Joel Dreyfus, who wrote, he used to run The Root, for example, and wrote one of the great essays on that phrase, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, called A Cage of Words. He used to run The Root and would take, you know, was very open to that source. So I think, you know, to be less shy. I know some of people personally who are very shy about offering their, but to really offer yourself as a presence and as a voice to the media in whatever way that you're possible. And also I want to add to growing younger scholars. And I know the organization has done that more in late years, but I remember, I have to say, like Leslie Desmongs, when he was running, like way back in the days, used to have Professor Charlene Desir and I think Regine John Chardon. He used to have us like once a Saturday just to come and chat with him. And just that casual mentorship, I think, is also very important in terms of extending the reach beyond existing membership and beyond academia as well.
I'm so glad you mentioned all of that. It's been something that I have, as an individual, have grew up in this association. My first conference was 2002. So this is a space that has been very important to me. One thing where you did suggest that we have like a roster of experts in various fields. For those who renewed their membership, you saw that we had a survey. So if you take the time to fill out that survey, it'll be public. People can see that there is a person who is an economist or an expert in water reclamation or whatever your expertise is. It'll be searchable by the public. So you can maybe go back and fill that out if you have the interest. I don't know if other folks want to jump in here as well. We have just one more question that I had prepared. Okay, so while we are transitioning into what we can do as an association, I thought it was important that we ask all of ourselves this next question. And I'll read it in both languages, and then my last question I'm going to be reading in Creole. So to all of us, there are almost 100 of us right here, right now, and who knows how many on the live stream. How do you evaluate your own praxis? And to whom are you accountable? Qui jan ou évaluer praxis pao, et puis à qui est-ce ou doit bay compte avant? Something to be to think about. C'est ça un bagay pour réfléchir. Pour finir, il y a des questions préparées. Nous avons quelques questions qui m'ont posées. Et quelques temps, nous comptons avoir espace pour ça. We have some questions in the chat, so hopefully we'll have time. I do want to say that this last question deliberately is inspiring us to think as an association. The entire town hall is going to be for all the members to participate in answering this, this question broken into more specific questions. But réalité militant, c'est un impact travail pour transformer et structurer pouvoir, c'est deux. En réalité, pour déboucher un potentiel libératoire dans la praxis académique militante, c'est charpente ou bien structurer institution en lui-même. Et puis, structurer qui encourage quelques pratiques, d'une façon spécifique, qui genre nous a transformé et structurer ça, pour obliger nous à compte envers cellules militantes et puis mouvements. That last question I have in English as well. How specifically do we transform a reward structure so that we're accountable to communities and movements? Eh bien, Sabine nous a commencé avec vous.
C'est une question qui est très difficile. Hier soir, nous avons discuté moi-même ensemble avec ma mère sur cette question. Nous avons un pile de difficultés dans la question. Parce que un premier élément pour nous garder, nous vivons dans une société côté que institutions, sous j'en nous dit en créole, vraiment sous la graba. C'est-à-dire, toute dynamique, ça, on a dit là, c'est de dynamique que institutions supportées. Mais nous, face à une situation actuellement, côté que institutions pas capables de répondre de rôle en dans la société côté que m'a vivre là. Là, on a regardé comment est-ce que l'université l'État réduit à un pot de chagrin, tellement il y a un conflit en dedans tout, et toutes les facultés ont très mal fonctionné. Et là, nous regardons en dedans l'espace militant et tout. espace militant, nous capables de dire depuis 12 janvier 2010, il y a de gros problèmes qui ont traversé l'espace militant qui dès qu'on a en certain moment qu'on servi de espace côté que on monde sous gon pian dans militant sous gon pian d'académique qui était capable de réfléchir à un certain moment. On bon gros intellectuel haïtien, l'autre monde tant que Gérard Pierre Charles par exemple, c'était un monde qui était à la fois te gen pied dans tout de espace et qui était capable de porter de réponses, qui était capable de réfléchir à un certain moment. Mais depuis 12 janvier 2010, faut que nous admettons que mise sous tutelle pays a li passé via ONG tout. ONG vient retourner en seule façon que tout le monde vient pour reproduire tout dans le pays. Et par rapport à ça, il vient faire que potentiel revendicatif et potentiel combatif qui te gagné dans l'institution ça qui te permettre qu'on réfléchisse à un certain moment, il pas gagné encore. Parce que et sans que on pas dire que ou pas bon comme là, mais il y a deux décisions qu'on pas capable, il y a deux bagages qu'on pas décider qu'on dit pour compte, il y a deux bagages qu'on pas décider qu'on fait pour compte par rapport au fait que institution ça yo dépendent de ONG pour fonctionner. Qui est-ce qui pour rendre compte? Pas de personne pour rendre compte parce que ONG qui ça fait ou saper tout lien qui était gagné entre institutions ça qui c'était des institutions de référence de 1986 jusqu'à année 2000 depuis 2010 fin passé pas de lien entre ça que moun yo te connait entre guillemets base yo institution ça yo encore lien ça l'immédiatisé uniquement par l'argent que ONG yo a bail là. Et institution ça yo même yo pas gen lien ensemble avec université l'État. Du coup, moi même c'est un gros challenge pour moi qui est sous gain pour rendre compte parce que avant tout rendre compte là c'est d'abord faire rapport narratif avec rapport financier. C'est comme ça institution ça vient à développer. Ça vient dit tout ou vient une société civile tout qui sont société civile qui c'est seul ça l'a fait c'est petit projet seulement l'a exécuté. Et dans l'exécution de projet ça pas bon capital réflexif qui est capable de sortir parce que c'est de petits projets qui sortent depuis à l'étranger. Par exemple, si on veut réfléchir à l'autonomie femme en tant que féministe en Haïti. Mais qui ça qui est une femme autonome en Haïti par rapport au fait que gon façon que réfléchir femme autonome dans l'autre société. Mais nous pas de problème d'autonomie nous-mêmes comme femmes en Haïti. Nous capable de problème d'autonomie qui sont autonomie contrôlée dans un cadre, un rapport pouvoir qui configuré de rapport de manière spécifique entre femmes avec garçons. Parce que si monsieur va prendre petit, automatiquement sorti dans la rue ou le travail pour porter comme ça en dedans ou pas de contrôle sur ressources ça pour dire comme ça ressources ça c'est pour moi que m'a utiliser, m'a fait ça avec lui pour moi. Nous pas de problème autonomie, nous pas de problème sorti dans la rue, nous avons problème utilisation ressources ça qui ça l'a fait à l'intérieur d'un cadre de rapport de pouvoir femme avec garçon qui est spécifique. Là, mais on pas permettre qu'on fasse une étude sur qui ça formerait l'autonomie parallèlement. Yo imposons une forme d'autonomie qui allait dans le sens microcrédit. Est-ce que c'est microcrédit qui apporte des réponses par rapport avec ça que nous sommes capables de en autonomie en Haïti? Là, on a regardé question participation politique. Au nom de participation politique, femmes ont une bonne dérive tout qui fait dans la société internationale a imposé de femmes dans n'importe qui espace pour faire n'importe qui ça. Est-ce que kounye la question ça vient tourner que li vient poser question femme nan quand on son essence liée.
So Gerald mentioned that you can be in spaces and producing radical progressive analyses and ideas to the world, but a major constraint for many of us is the academic institution itself and the reward structure. How do we transform this reward structure so that we're accountable to activist communities and movements? Gerald, if you can take a stab at this question.
Well, that's a very difficult question. I mean, as an elder amongst us, I can say that part of the accountability, particularly in terms of what I produce, which is what I spend most of my time doing, you get feedback. I mean, you get feedback from the radio, because I do lots of radio. You get feedback from journals. You get feedback from newspapers. Before the lockdown, you used to get feedback from people just cowering you and talking to you directly in your ear. I think we also have to recognize that it's going to be difficult to alter the reward structure on an individual level. It would have to be done on a collective level. For example, many faculties are unionized. Many faculties are part of national unions, such as the American Federation of Teachers or American Association of University Professors, for example, the National Education Association. And so if you're going to change the reward structure, it's going to have to be much more than an individual effort. It's going to have to be a collective effort. Although I have to say that as a person who has accommodated myself to this idea that you publish and you get rewarded, I'm a person personally who can deal with that kind of reward structure.
Merci. Sabine, est-ce que vous avez un dernier mot à ajouter avant Internet ou tomber?
Et pour continuer avec ça que je dit, je pense que actuellement là nous avons un moment qui est très très difficile pour question et réflexion, pour question pensée en dedans pays. Moi-même je pense que un élément qui est capable important pour nous refaire, c'est refaire de liens de proximité entre nous, parce que vin gagner ça vient créer un gap énorme tout entre classes sociales en différentes catégories dans mi-temps moun yo. C'est garder comment est-ce que nous-mêmes nous capables de réapproprier nous de propre tête nous et capable de faire lien entre nous. Et c'est dans refaire lien entre nous ça que nous avons gagné de monde pour nous rendre compte parce que nous avons parole que nous te dit à un monde à un certain moment. Comment nous avons fait ça? Moi je pense que gain de problématiques qui c'est de problématiques qu'on veut le pas veut li concerner tout haïtien. Question environnement sont questions qui concernent tout haïtien. Entrer en dedans on s'en après les quartiers ghetto par exemple entre guillemets que ce soit Cité Soleil ou bien La Saline, chita discuter sur environnement, c'est pas fond projet. Discuter avec un haïtien pareil ou sur qui ça environnement veut dire pour. Discuter avec un haïtien pareil ou qui ça éducation veut faire pour. Apprendre que le reconnaître moi comme un humain et moi apprendre reconnaître tout comme un humain. Ce rapport ça n'est pas médiatisé par aucun ONG, il n'est pas médiatisé par l'État, c'est nous qui choisissons qu'à un certain moment, moi après retourner faire lien à un haïtien pareil moi et m'a bien compte pour me rendre là bien un devoir de redevabilité envers moi-même sous ça nous dit n'a fait ensemble et me pense que ça c'est une façon pour nous capable dire comme ça, est-ce que nous pas capable créer en commun ensemble encore sans que ça pas médiatisé par aucun monde et puis à un certain moment il aurait été que ça existait et ça capable porter un projet politique en dedans société qui capable permettre que nous réfléchir pour propre tête nous que à un certain moment c'est pas l'international qui vient dire mais si ça qui pour passer dans pays nous capable exiger institution que mais qui ça que nous voulons nous capable exiger l'université jouer rôle et différentes formes institutions capable jouer rôle en dedans société. Mais tant que nous était que rapport nous a médiatisé sous l'argent que l'externe a bail, tant que l'externe pas ba nous pas gagner nous capable construire peut-être nous. Je pense que là rapport que n'a parlé que qui est m'a prendre compte comment m'a créé un praxis pensée par rapport avec en même temps que m'a fait théorie mais m'a fait militance politique en même temps pour me capable dégager une compréhension de société. C'est ça très très difficile pour nous faire tant que c'est pas nous-mêmes qui décidons nous recréer lien entre nous sans que nous pas aucun monde qui vienne dire nous mais comment pour nous créer lien dans mi-temps nous qui c'est haïtien.
Eh bien, Mamie Raté lancé un mot de guerre pour finir. But Edwidge looks like she wanted to say something. So, welcome Edwidge to the conversation.
Oh, I was going to say, complementary to the reward structure, also we have to think about the punishment structure that is in Haiti right now, where people go on the radio, they express a certain kind, we've had the case with the lawyer who was killed and the student who was killed. And how do we as an organization, as scholars in the similar fields of people who are being silenced either because they're not being heard or because they were killed. And so how is that work looked into and taken up, right? Either if not fully the political work, but the academic work of people like that who might be afraid now to come out and say certain things. So I think that's also a place where the association can be helpful and taking up a little bit of that burden for people for whom it's not so much of a reward structure, that's the question, it's more of a punishment, and for whom it can actually be a life and death issue.
Thank you for that very important reminder. We do unfortunately have to end the session in 4 minutes. So Mamira, all eyes are on you to do your mic drop. So but I do want to Edwidge's last point, the town hall will end, just like Regine was noting, there was a letter that we wrote last year. We are going to spend some time at the town hall to start a collective letter to respond to the urgent crisis in specifically the murders of the recent murders with the student. And so, Mamira, tout mon aptanu.
Oui, bon, m'espérer, I'm going to live up to the expectations. So I wanted to start out, right, saying that the Academy, of course, has always been a site of production and reproduction of power. And the late trio whom we keep invoking in this space, our intellectual ancestor, Ayi Bobo, reminds us that knowledge production, right, the sciences, is a political project, a civilizational project. And several other critical Africana thinkers have pointed out, right, how the sciences can sometimes, right, be propaganda to justify inhumane socioeconomic practices. So I'm going to speak from my positionality as a visiting assistant professor, right? A position I understand that used to serve as a way for professors from different institutions with relative job security to visit other institutions in order to share their research and perspective. And of course, with the neoliberal turn, which did not, right, spare the academy, this position has been increasingly transformed in order to circulate the surplus, right, of PhDs in the US under the guise of meritocracy, right? So these second-tier researchers, scholars are told over and over again that publishing and grant acquisition are key to securing a tenure-track position. And this argument is used, right, to justify paying visiting folks $20,000 to $40,000 less with no benefits and job security to sometimes do more labor, right? Teach introductory classes, relieve tenured professors on sabbatical, or pilot new programs, as opposed to, right, a starting salary of $80,000 to $100,000 plus with benefits for a tenure track position. So the academy does not escape the logic of capitalism, which is to produce a commodity, right, the degree, the diploma, in order to maximize its profit, right? So in this contingent position, visiting assistant professors' ability to socially reproduce themselves is continually threatened. This limits their capacity, or my capacity, to do research and publish in traditional academic spaces, right? Because I'm doing a lot of the teaching. And then let alone, right, to publish in alternative presses or other spaces of knowledge diffusion where lay people look to for their analysis. It is also discouraged, right, for visitings, right, who are trying to navigate this job market to take on, right, more transformative activist roles as the public intellectuals, right, demanding social change. So it would seem today that we're at another conjuncture similar to this 1968 moment I described earlier, when academia in the US is in need of another overhaul. And from this contingent position, I still do my international solidarity and translation work. I have attempted to amplify voices on the ground via my publications and academic journals, but also militant magazines about women's and feminist movements in Haiti in relationship to empire, racial capitalism, state abandonment, corruption, and dictatorship. I have volunteered my research and facilitation skills to support organizational and movement building on the ground in Haiti, attempting to undo their culture of dependency on the nonprofit industrial complex. I have also put to use my multilingual skills, not only to ensure that I engage in my own academic work with Haitian scholars, but also to translate for my Haitian colleagues wanting to speak back to their US counterparts. I have also joined academic and political formations to do this work of translation in the other direction, from Haiti to the US, right?
Mhm.
And so my challenge is to all the people who have the job security and tenure is to do more of that, right? And to use this leverage of power to challenge the academic structures that make contingent positions permanent, right? That make this visiting circulation actually an entire necessary piece to the structure, right? So this is why I said, disclaimer, it may seem like I'm taking shots, right? But it's also really that I'm calling on the folks who have this job security, who are more senior, to really, right, speak back to this meritocracy narrative that keeps circulating within academia that really is a cover-up for maintaining, right, a hierarchy in this knowledge production process that we've engaged.
Mamira, yeah, this is so relevant, so important. And that's the thing that we're all going to hear as we go to our next session. And I want us to keep hearing that. And those of us with power and the association itself, what can we do to push back at these structures? That what Edwidge said, the punishment structures, not just the reward structures. I want to thank all the panelists, all the translators, all the tech people, and all of you for coming. This has been really, really insightful and inspiring, if depressing is, you know what. But I really would like to, all of you to go and reflect on what we were saying. Mamira, thank you for the final word. I just had to close it out. This session starts in 8 minutes, so we're going to have to click stop, but we'll look forward to seeing you at the town hall. Kembe Fem.